How much do you think that that was a factor of NATO training since 2014, for example? And how do they look at the broader geopolitical tensions, if you like, rhetoric of, nuclear war or Trump coming in? How do people in Kursk and on the ground look at it?
Everybody what their opinion was on Trump, because when I was there, it was right when Trump was coming in. Almost all of them said that they were looking forward to the Trump administration. They were hoping that he could bring peace, basically, was what most of the soldiers I spoke to said, was that they were optimistic that he would hopefully be able to end the war. On the geopolitical level, according to the Ukrainian people, he's not a dictator.
What do you take away from this in the broader picture of the news cycle and, Trump playing kingmaker, peacemaker, right?
Actual troops on the ground think, from like your intelligence officer to your lowest grunt, they almost all universally said that they know that they're losing this war.
This is the Global Gambit.
All right, guys, part 2. Thank you very much for coming back. If you missed part 1, it's about the Middle East. And Chris, I think, feeling increasingly less comfortable with my string of questions because I was trying to ask him things and he's just like, I don't know. Or like, I'm not a diplomat, like, stop asking me these. But something I do really want to hear about, Chris, is obviously I mentioned in part 1 the comments coming out of the Munich Security Conference about Trump's comments and their perception of what Trump represents now, not just for Ukraine, but broader international security. But before we maybe go into some of that, I really want to understand your experiences of going into Kursk, because I've been to Ukraine quite a few times during the conflict. I've been to the front lines, or as close as I could get. I've been to Kharkiv after the Ukrainians reclaimed it, but I haven't been to Kursk, at least when it wasn't a war zone. So how did that come about, and what were your main takeaways, be it at the time or subsequently?
When I first landed in Poland and took that 17-hour train ride to Kyiv, the whole time going in, I still had no idea what my trip in Ukraine would be like. I had nothing kind of planned other than we're going to try to go to the front line, but you know how things are there. They change by the minute. So I had no expectations. And I was kind of really I wanted to get to the front as soon as possible, but my fixer, my guide there, really smart, very put together, basically a producer of the videos I did. He said, let's spend a day or two in Kyiv first. And it was completely worth it because one of the first nights there, I went out and I got drinks with a couple of military intelligence Ukrainian guys that were part of their intelligence agencies. And when we got pretty smashed. And that's how you get to know somebody. That's how you build trust, is you just get obliterated, absolutely annihilated. I don't know what these drinks were called, but in Ukraine, they got this certain kind of mix of, it's almost like a mix of a Red Bull, or what do they call it there? A Nonstop or something, mixed with some, it was insane. There must have been, I don't know what they could, what's the worm in it, the green fairy liquor.
Yeah.
So, okay.
Non-stop, yeah.
He decided that I'm not an asshole and was like, I'll help you out, basically. And I said, would you be able to get me into Kursk? And he thought about it for a second. He said, you know what? I actually know the guy that handles the public relations for Kursk. And I'm going to hit that guy up and try to get you connected. So that was how I got permission, because basically they don't let anybody there. They don't let any Western journalists go there basically ever. I mean, a few have been, but it's very difficult. So I met them early in the morning. We jumped into an armored vehicle, and then I started having second thoughts, and I was like, can I cancel this? Maybe this is not a good idea. And we took about an hour drive up there, and the drive itself was just all the roads are chewed to hell, and it takes forever. You got to go 5 miles an hour on these just destroyed, muddy, terrible conditions of the roads. And it was surreal passing through the international boundary between Ukraine and Russia. It was just completely felt like I was watching somebody do it. And I remember passing through the checkpoint, and it's just this blown apart, destroyed check. There's Bradleys that are also blown up on the side of the road, and T90 or T72s littered all over the place. and you pass through, and it's weird because you got this really friendly, like inviting, you know how the checkpoints or when you switch between an oblast, there's like that big text, not a monument, but like a sign.
No, you'll have
Soviet
a big
style,
sign or symbol, and then it has the big text written
yeah,
out,
yeah, right.
sometimes in English to it. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's like this beautiful kind of sign, but it's also got bullet holes all through it. And you could just see how once it was meant to welcome people through, like, welcome to Ukraine, welcome to Russia. And now it's filled with, there's concrete pillboxes. And so from there, yeah, going through Ukraine was through Russia was eye opening to me, because I got to speak to the actual Russian people there and ask them questions, and see how they were treating them, see what the conditions are like. The biggest takeaway for me was just how much Ukraine is pouring into that region, because at this point it was the end of my trip and I had been all over the front everywhere else except for Kherson. And so I could just tell that by a factor of 10, they were sending more supplies there, more armored vehicles, troops, and really it seemed like their main push from what I had seen everywhere else. Right. And I couldn't figure it out. I'm like, why is this so worth it to them? Because it appears to be just, they're like really banking on, and they find it to be very important.
Yeah, I mean, well, that you've kind of partially answered it, I guess, or maybe, open the cat at the door for more dissection on that, because, well, I've got two questions on this then. So firstly, there's been a lot of back and forth about, obviously, Russian versus Ukrainian treatment of POWs, but also just civilians of occupied areas or areas that are under control of the opposing force. And one of the things that quickly became apparent when the Ukrainians took this area of Kursk was their treatment of the locals versus the Russians, which have been much more, forcing families apart, relocating children into deeper parts of Siberia, etc. So basically violations of international humanitarian law. So on human rights law as well. So how did you see the Ukrainians treating locals? Was there tension into violence from communities, or did the Ukrainian troops just allow Russians to go about their business, stay as long as they didn't get in the way of military operations? Like, take me through this, because I'm very interested.
So first, I'll preface this all by saying I saw what the Ukrainians wanted me to see. They weren't going to take me there and then show me them like taking someone out back and shooting them in the head in summary execution. Like, that was never going to happen. I will say what I saw was they treated them well, and they were honest with me as far as I could tell. As far as, I met a bunch of Russians that were openly saying that they hated the Ukrainians, that they didn't respect them, that they didn't like them, that they weren't getting what they needed. And then they're arguing, and the Ukrainian press officers saying, like, I just brought you supplies yesterday, you're lying. And they're like, no, you're not bringing what we need diabetic insulin. He's like, I gave you my insulin. So obviously I don't know for a fact what happened. All I can tell is that I know for a fact that they do have a center there where anyone who wants to come can go there and get food and have a place to sleep and a heated, it's like a giant, I won't say what type of building it is, but it's basically a shelter for anyone who needs to be taken care of. And so there was like what they wanted to show me versus what I wanted to get out of it. And I felt like I was able to get to see what I needed to see for the tactical picture, the strategic picture. And also I got to see what they wanted to talk about and show, which was the treatment of civilians. And so I've also seen, like, Ukraine has blown up civilian buildings. They took me through a road that had been just completely annihilated by Russian Fab 250 bombs that were launched from a jet and blew this whole street up. I spoke to the Russian people who had their home completely obliterated, and they were crying and showing me this house that they lived in for 30 years. It was these 3 or 4 women that were over 60. It was very difficult to watch. It was heartbreaking. And so I also saw Ukraine blow up houses that Russians were using as shelter. So, I'm not, obviously you cannot equate the two. They're nowhere near the same thing because Ukraine was invaded. But from what I saw, yeah, indiscriminate bombing by Russia, and the Ukrainians were making an effort to try to show that they were treating the people there with respect. There was one thing that they pointed out that resonated with me particularly was they said, here's a monument of fallen Russian Russians who had died fighting Ukraine, fighting in other wars. And he was like, the soldier told me, he said, we leave this monument up, we don't destroy it, but when Russian forces come through, they destroy all of our monuments and they desecrate our monuments to our fallen. So that was something that stuck with me.
Curious. I mean, naturally, we know the Battle of Kursk, one of the most pivotal of the Second World War, particularly from an aerial standpoint as well. So I'm just kind of curious, though, while you were there, I don't know how long you were there for, but what did you see in the form of actually military engagement? Were the Russians indifferent about the symbolism of this place? From a political lens, some analysts have argued that Putin doesn't actually give a crap about the situation in Kursk because ultimately it's minuscule in terms of size and strategical significance versus Eastern Ukraine, and that's why he's not really bothered by it and has sent more North Koreans. More on that in a minute. What was the Russian activity to the Ukrainians whilst you were there, if any?
The intensity of the fire there was a lot higher, especially outgoing from Ukraine. Like they were firing. I think it might have been that they had pre-coordinated that because I was going there, they fired additional shells to basically keep the Russians' heads down. Because when I was there, they were firing off, like constantly firing outgoing, which is unusual because everywhere else that I was on the front, you would hear like 2 Ukrainian outgoing for every, Russian fire was a lot more incoming. So I think that the intensity of the fire there to me indicated that it was very important to Ukraine. I'm not certain. The amount of casualties coming out of there seemed to indicate that it's very important to Russia as well. On the more strategic geopolitical level, I don't know how. It's tough to gauge how important without knowing for certain how much they're dedicating to it. It's surprising to me that they haven't, allocated more resources to taking Kursk back. I would think that would be a blight and sort of an embarrassment from Russia's point of view to have, but it could be, as you said, it could be more that they're just like, we don't really care. Let's send North Koreans. And if they take it, great. And if they can't take it back, it's just some farmland.
Yeah, no, I think it's just, I thought when that happened that it would be like, oh my God, we're going to do this because this is the first time Russia's been invaded since the Second World War, Napoleon, and all that sort of running commentary, right? But largely from, the studying of Russia that I've done in my background, this is Putin just being like, sort of ultimately, I think it's an indication that his contempt for the Russian people. No, he doesn't care about them. Not that most people, if they had any decency, would think so. But that brings us to the North Koreans. So how many were there, Chris? And how many porn sites did you see them watching?
They couldn't return fire because they were just so busy on their iPhones, enamored by. No, we're
gonna get banned for this now on YouTube.
When I was there, I asked them if they had seen. When I was there in November, they were honest and they were like, "We haven't seen them. We haven't actually seen them." But since then, there's been a lot of photographic and video proof that they've provided, or evidence, I should say. The Ukrainians have put evidence out, and whether or not people want to believe that evidence is up to them. I think it's credible.
Well, if I can push you a little bit further on this then, because I think what's interesting is obviously there's always the rhetoric of it's their perspective versus our perspective. There are two narratives, and then there's the truth or whatever. People will say whatever they want to say to fit their narrative and their argument. But being there on the ground for both of us, I mean, admittedly, I haven't been to this unique place, but both having visited it and seeing the situation for what it is, you understand the difference between people who vocalize things from one perspective and those like, who pretend to be a Russian, Ukrainian Russian local who's actually from Southern California. I think you know who I'm talking about. I can't remember her name. I don't really want to reference it anyway. But like being there yourself, how much did that reinforce you or not? On some of the points that Ukraine does make, because admittedly they do change parts to suit the narrative. It's a war; they have to, right? And they're very good at information warfare.
Something that I took away from the trip was like, okay, so when I deployed to Iraq, I thought like this is a justified war. We should be there. We're doing the right thing. And then when I left Iraq, I had the feeling that they didn't want us there. They don't want our help. We are meddling and probably making things worse. And so I was worried when I went to Ukraine. I thought, am I going to go there and things aren't going to be what I expect? Am I going to meet a corrupt system of people who don't want to be fighting this war? Is this, what is the narrative going to be in my head versus the reality on the ground? And from everyone that I talked to and spoke to, and they didn't just show me the roses and pretty parts of the front. They showed me the terrible parts. They showed me the parts where they're losing ground. They let me speak to soldiers who are exhausted and have been basically pressed into service for 3-4 years longer than they're supposed to be. Like people who are unhappy about having to serve. I got to see the wide gamut, but even those dudes that were like, I signed up for 3 years and that was 6 years ago, and they're forcing me to fight at this point and I just want to go home. Even those guys were still saying, fuck, sorry, I guess I can't curse, but like they're basically saying, screw.
I'm not going to cancel you for that.
Yeah, they're saying, even those guys are still saying, screw Russia. We don't, I'm fighting for my homeland. So even the people that I spoke to that were unhappy and like the most sort of, how do you put it? Not disgruntled, but just like, I would be pissed too. And you saw American soldiers were the same thing happened to them. They were stop lost and forced to serve for longer than they thought they would. But there's still that belief that they're fighting for their homeland. And I walked away with a more feeling of sort of camaraderie with them. And I felt like the Ukrainians that I met, they have sensibilities and values that are very similar to Americans and our American soldiers' ideas of service and selflessness and sacrifice and personal courage. The amount of courage that I saw was just unbelievable. Like I was terrified there. I was scared out of my friggin' gourd. And it took me everything in my being to keep putting one foot in front of the other. And I was there for such a brief amount of time. Those guys have to do that every day. And so, yeah, that was what I took away from it, was that fortunately, it is what I thought it was. And that Ukraine does appear to me to be a justified cause to support.
Oh, for sure. I appreciate the sentiments you've had. I felt, I mean, I was there in I don't know if diplomatic word is the right term, but I was there in a sort of specific capacity a couple of years ago as part of my work in the UN World Banking stuff. But to sort of bring that into the connection of the military and the geopolitical, if you like, when you're on the ground and then sort of what you've just said about the way that they conduct themselves, how much do you think that was a factor of NATO training since 2014, for example? And how do they look at the broader geopolitical tensions, if you like, rhetoric of, nuclear war or Trump coming in? How do people in Kursk and on the ground look at it from their perspective?
asked everybody what their opinion was on Trump, because when I was there, it was right when Trump was coming in, and I guess I didn't know what to expect, they would say, but almost all of them said that they were looking forward to the Trump administration and that they were hoping that he could bring peace, basically, was what most of the soldiers I spoke to said, was that they were optimistic that he would hopefully be able to end the war. On the geopolitical level, the guys that I spoke to, um, there was a couple that I talked to that had some interesting perspectives on the larger strategic picture. One guy, Gandalf,
Gandalf.
yeah, Gandalf. Really, it was code. That's his call sign, Gandalf.
Okay.
Really, really smart dude. Very. Uh, I enjoyed speaking with him, but I was asking him about, like, well, everyone is saying that Zelensky is a dictator. What, that he's paused elections, and I'm just trying to understand that from like an American point of view. And he broke it down in an interesting way, because I think a lot of people don't understand that that's the holding off on elections happened because the parliament basically required it. The Ukrainian constitution required it. So according to the Ukrainian people, he's not a dictator, and that the pause of the elections, that's something that I believed happened in the UK during World War II, for instance. Like, when your whole society is put at war, it's difficult to invest the resources and the money that's required and the manpower required to hold elections. And then even if you do hold elections, there's a large portion of your people that are outside the country displaced or are fighting on the front lines. So is it truly going to be a representation, that election, if it's held? So that was an interesting conversation that I had. I go on.
No, I think that's no. I mean, under the a Ukrainian constitution, you're not allowed and supposed to have elections during wartime. It's written into the constitution. It's not just Zelensky being some dictatorial tyrant. And yeah, you had the National Government of Unity, or National Unity Government of the UK during the Second World War, where the Labour and Conservative governments came together to deal with the Battle of Britain and so on. So no, that's 100% true. And anyone who tells you otherwise is deliberately manipulating information and facts to, again, suit a narrative. I.e., Zelensky is, not that I have my issues with Zelensky at times, but he's not a dictator in that regard, and the Ukrainian people stand quite firmly behind him. I mean, polls and data, I think, shows that. But I guess my last question sort of brings it full circle to what we mentioned at the beginning, which was, Trump's making these claims about peace deal. He's making claims about what Ukraine should do. There's been some news I read earlier on X that, suggesting that Ukraine is open to the idea of $500 billion worth of mineral exchange in return for continued arms and munitions and stuff. Like, when you've come from this ground and you've seen the people there, and just keeping in mind what you said about their opinion of Trump, what do you take away from this in the broader picture of the news cycle and Trump playing kingmaker, peacemaker, right? I don't know. I'm just curious for your final thoughts on all this sort of stuff.
The thing that I tried to press in the videos, but maybe didn't press hard enough, was that, and this surprised me from speaking and learning from what the actual troops on the ground think, from like your intelligence officer to your lowest grunt, they almost all universally said that they know that they're losing this war, that they know that the situation is dire for them strategically on the tactical level. Like, it's not looking great. So, and this is something that I see a lot of publications will, and I understand wanting to say that it's one thing, wanting to, say that Ukraine is crushing Russia, that they're destroying them. And they certainly are putting up an insanely good fight, and they're destroying a lot of Russian equipment. Maybe maybe that will go somewhere, that attrition, but as it stands right now, they know that it's not going great, and that there's a potential for the front line collapsing. And what everyone is saying, I think, without saying it, is that, a peace agreement right now would be in Ukraine's interest, I think. And I think that's what the soldiers think as well, is that they need this war to stop. That, that's just from the little tiny picture that I got from speaking with the guys on the front, like, they want this war to end. So if Trump is able to come in and end it, I think that would be in their benefit. I don't know. We'll have to see. He's different approaches have been floated. We'll have to see what he actually does with the peace negotiations. Like, is he going to actually do maximum pressure? Is he going to? It seems like this is the first step to getting conservatives to feel less salty about supporting Ukraine. If we can say as Americans, we're not just giving them billions of dollars worth of defense and aid, we're getting something in return. We're getting billions of dollars in rare earth metals as back. That's an easier way to sell it to your conservative base than just like, hey, we're getting taken for a ride here. We're giving money and weapons for nothing. So to me, that seems to me like the first step towards getting the conservative base on board with what might need to happen to pressure Putin to come to the table. Because if you're Russia right now, you don't want to come to the table. Why would you want to negotiate if you're gaining territory? It's not in their interest. That's just my perspective on it.
No, I think it's a very reasonable take. I think you have your preferences, but you're also based in the world of reality. I think that's why you and I have a similar outlook on these things. I would prefer Ukraine to be a sovereign state based on its 91 borders, but there is no getting around the fact that the Russians have the momentum. They are making gains, even if it costs them, an entire generation of Russians. That's not a priority for Moscow or Putin specifically. And ultimately, yes, I do think that Ukraine should give back. I mean, to be fair, always people seem to forget that America's not just flinging money. This is a feedback loop that gives into American, industrial complex, right? And human capital and knowledge transfer and stuff like that. So, but yeah, for sure, I'm not opposed to the idea, and I just wonder pragmatically how it would work, because a lot of the precious metals in eastern Ukraine are underneath the war zone, which is now
but that's why I think
That's
why I think it's just a way to get conservatives.
Oh, right. I see. So it's a ploy. Oh, interesting.
That's what I think. I think it's just like, hey, look, they agreed to give us this money. Will it ever happen? Probably not. But like, it's a way, maybe we only get a little bit of that. But still, it's like Trump can say we're getting something instead of basically before. I think Biden was kind of like, hey, we'll give you whatever you need for as long as you need it, like nothing in return. So that's just my read of it.
Well, and on that quite provocative but insightful take there, Chris, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much for coming back on. It's been a pleasure. We need to do this more often. I really love chatting with you. It's nice to have someone who is, to say, feel on a similar wavelength. And everyone, if you enjoyed the conversation as well, then do check out part 1, previous conversations with Chris, and consider subscribing or whatever you do on YouTube for future chats and content for myself. But anyway, everyone, as we say on the Global Gambit, you've either got to get playing or be played. Take care, everyone.